If you've been around for a while, then you know how much I care about financial freedom for all. One thing that often gets in the way of that is debt. That's why I'm happy to announce that I've partnered with an amazing organization called Juno. Juno helps you get lower interest rates by using the power of group negotiation. It is a completely free resource that you can use to secure lower interest rates on new and existing student loans. Head to the link in the episode show notes to find out more.
This is the Dreamers Podcast, episode 57. Today is February 15th, 2022, and this is our 1-year anniversary episode. There are too many ways to earn money. What you need is focus. I know this might sound crazy, but after interviewing so many different people on the podcast, one thing that I realized is it's not the shortage of possibilities in terms of how you can earn money. Of course, you need to have the information. But once you have the information, it's easy to just want to go in every single direction possible, because listening to those guests, you hear about the 1,000 different ways that they've made or built their wealth. We keep hearing about millionaires have 7 streams of income, and all that is great, but it's easy to lose focus when you're all over the place. So I actually think that focusing on one thing and figuring it out and earning money from that one thing is actually going to give you a better chance at reaching your goal. Focus is key. And once you've invested the time and energy into learning that one thing and mastering it, then you can move on to the other thing. Otherwise, it's just very easy to get lost.
Hello, world. Welcome to the Dreamers Podcast. I am Stephanie Anne-Lyse, also known as Anne-Lyse Wealth. I'm a financial coach and an author. I self-published my first book, Dream of Legacy, a guide to help dreamers reach financial independence and build generational wealth. In this podcast, I'll have conversations with experts and thought leaders who dare to follow their dreams. You'll hear about their journey and their money stories. I hope it inspires you, dreamers out there, to live life on your own terms.
Come on, dreamers, let's change the world!
This podcast is brought to you by Dream of Legacy. Check out dreamoflegacy.com for resources to assist you on your journey to financial independence. Before we get into today's episode, please take a couple minutes to go into Apple Podcasts, if you're listening from an Apple device, to rate and review the podcast. If you appreciate the free resources that are provided in this podcast, then the best way to let me know is to do just that. Reviews help the podcast be more visible, and it helps other dreamers discover the podcast. So thank you. I appreciate you. And now let's get back to today's episode.
Hello, welcome to the Dreamers Podcast. I'm your host, Anne-Lyse Wealth, and I'm so happy that you're here for today's episode. Today's episode is extra special. It's our 1-year anniversary. I can't believe we made it. This past year has been challenging, to say the least, but I'm beyond excited that you stuck with me and that we've made it this far. Thank you so much for tuning in. I thought that for episode 57, or the 1-year anniversary episode, I would kind of look back at this past year and what I've learned from recording 56 episodes of the podcast. An interesting fact is I'm actually recording this episode live from the south of France. I meant to record before leaving Atlanta, but I didn't get a chance to do it. I've been traveling, I'm jet lagged, but I committed to showing up. So here I am. I'm excited to talk to you about some of the lessons that I learned recording this podcast for the past year. All right. I do want to say that these lessons are in no particular order, but yeah, let's get into it. Lesson number 1, start before you're ready. A lot of times we want to wait until things are perfect, figure out how to execute the plan so that it's flawless. But one thing that was reinforced this past year for me is that done is really better than perfect. Just start. You can figure things out along the way. You can improve along the way. Our need to sometimes make sure that things are perfect before we start is actually taken away from people who need what we have to offer. So one of the lessons that I learned is to stop overanalyzing and over-preparing and just do it. Go for it and trust that you will figure it out, keep learning, and keep improving. The second lesson that I learned from doing this podcast, interviewing guests, is that consistency is key. Consistency beats talent. Week after week, I continue to show up here no matter what I had going on personally, whether it was raining, shining, traveling. And it really made a difference in me and hopefully also in you. And I really like the fact, a year after launching the podcast, that I kept showing up and sticking to my commitment and being consistent. From interviewing a lot of people on the podcast, every guest had consistency in common. The many interviews I've done have reminded me that if you want to win, one of the key things that you have to do is be consistent and not give up. You can tweak what it is that you are doing or offering, but you should be consistent no matter what and not give up. And eventually it will pay off as long as you're open and listening to the feedback that you're receiving. Consistency, consistency, consistency. The third lesson that I learned is that sometimes you have to pay the price to save the time, the energy, and ultimately make more money. I used to take a lot of pride in figuring things out, and I think that there's a balance between when it makes sense to do that and when it doesn't. But now I'm more willing to invest the money instead, so I can skip having to figure it all out on my own. Because really, it's a time saver. And as we hear all the time is money. The more time you have, the more money you can go and get. Or if that's not what you want to do, you can always use that time to do something that's fulfilling to you. So when I first launched the podcast, I invested in a launch course. It was a 6 weeks course that walked me through step by step what I needed to do to start the podcast, from even the show concept to editing to marketing, all of the above. And that was a great investment. That was a time saver. It gave me the confidence to go out there, start the podcast within a matter of, I think I actually ended up launching after 4 weeks and know exactly what to do. It's something that I use in my business as well. I look at a potential expense or investment in terms of, does it make sense for me to actually do this task? Is this above or below my hourly rate? And if I were to outsource it to someone else, how much more income would I be able to go get because I have this extra time? So instead of focusing so much on how much I will spend, I try to look at it as how much I will gain by making this investment if I get my time back. Work smarter, not harder. I believe in researching resources, people that can help me get to my destination faster. But I also understand that a very important part of having mentors, people who have done what you want to do, and investing in that is actually doing the work. So this past year, I've invested 5 figures in getting help through education, coaching, and really it's made a huge difference in my business, in my mindset, my life. And I'm constantly looking for ways to do what I want to do, but do it smarter. When I launched this podcast, I used to edit the podcast myself, and months into it, I realized that it wasn't the best use of my time. It's not an activity that I enjoyed. And also, it was very time consuming because it wasn't in my zone of genius. So instead of holding on to it so I could save money, I decided to invest in getting an editor. And I'm so thankful that I did that because, again, it freed up my time and it gave me an opportunity to go and earn more. If it can help me get to my destination faster or save me time, then I will definitely consider it. Number 4, there are too many ways to earn money. What you need is focus. I know this might sound crazy, but after interviewing so many different people on the podcast, one thing that I realized is it's not the shortage of possibilities in terms of how you can earn money. Of course, you need to have the information. But once you have the information, it's easy to just want to go in every single direction possible because listening to those guests, you hear about the 1,000 different ways that they've made or built their wealth. We keep hearing about millionaires have 7 streams of income, and all that is great. But it's easy to lose focus when you're all over the place. So I actually think that focusing on one thing and figuring it out and earning money from that one thing is actually going to give you a better chance at reaching your goal. Focus is key. And once you've invested the time and energy into learning that one thing and mastering it, then you can move on to the other thing. Otherwise, it's just very easy to get lost. Number 5, every investment isn't meant to give you financial returns, or at least not right away. You have to think about how a specific investment is helping you or is fitting in your overall strategy. This podcast, for instance, is not a revenue generator for me yet, but it brings opportunities, which ultimately brings money. So even though it's not a lead generator, I invested in an editor to buy back time. You can network with pretty much almost anyone with the internet. One of the questions that I've received a lot is, how did you get such and such guests on your podcast? And the answer is really by reaching out, not being afraid to hear no. From this show, or I've built some amazing relationships. I've also met some of my clients on this show. You shouldn't be intimidated or afraid to reach out to people that you want to learn from. And just be open to networking, because literally some of the people that you look up to or want to learn from are literally just a couple of messages away. Number 7, embrace incremental growth. Slow increase is increase. You have to celebrate the wins, no matter how small they are. Celebrate the wins along the way, regardless, because it's growing. Whatever you're doing is working. I remember attending FinCon, which is a conference for personal finance content creators. And Jamila Souffrant, the host of Journey to Launch, was on stage and she talked about that exact thing. And she shared a picture of her celebrating her first 5,000 downloads for a podcast. And now I think her podcast has had over 3 million downloads. So when you come in this game, or really whatever avenue that you decide to get into, it's so easy to compare yourself to the people who are absolutely killing it. But when you do that, you're actually taking away from what you are trying to build, and you might get discouraged. So one thing that I've had to continuously remind myself this past year is, listen, if every week you can get 1 more downloads than the week before, then you are winning, and you should celebrate that. Incremental growth is growth. Number 8, it's not necessarily the obvious choice that will lead to the bigger outcome. And I will take the podcast as an example. One thing that I quickly realized is that the bigger the guest doesn't mean the bigger the downloads. It's not always going to be beneficial for you to reach out for the obvious choice. Find the hidden gems, and they might actually go a long way. Number 9, people want to support you. They just don't know how. And what I mean by people, I'm not necessarily talking about your family or your friends. They are literally strangers on the internet who you look up to, you can learn from, but you haven't reached out to them. Now, I'm not suggesting to just go and start reaching out to random strangers on the internet, but one thing I believe in is serving others. So if there is someone that you are interested in learning from, then how about starting by serving them and then see where it takes you? Number 10 is not necessarily a lesson that I learned, but it's something that was reinforced this past year, is that you should always do your best. You never know who will be touched by your message or who is watching you. Do your best at all times. At some point last year, I had a big corporation reach out to me because they had found out about the podcast, and I was shocked. And it was just a reminder that you never know who's watching. And you never know how even like the person that you're interviewing for your show is the role that they're going to play in your life. When I first launched the ALW agency at the end of last year, every single person that was my client in the beginning were previous podcast guests. And so making sure that I was professional and giving a good impression actually ended up serving me in the long run, even though that was not something that I had calculated, but it just reinforces the importance of always doing your best. And I'll never get over receiving messages from people from really literally all over the world telling me how a specific episode or something that I said helped them. And it really makes me want to stick with it and keep showing up. But essentially, those are the 10 lessons that I learned this past year. And I'm just so glad that we've made it here. I launched this as a challenge to myself to be consistent no matter what was happening in my life. And 1 year later, here we are, 57 episodes in. I'm just really proud that I've made it here, and I'm really thankful for you for making it here as well. We did it. And now that I've hit this milestone, I need to figure out what is happening next, what my plans are for the show, but I would also love to hear your thoughts. If you're still listening at this point, let me know what you think. Should I keep the show going for another year? Do you get value from it? Has the show motivated you to create change in your life? Let me hear it. Reach out to me. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review. Tag the show at The Dreamers, that podcast on Instagram. I can't wait to connect with you. Let me know your thoughts. All right. I hope you enjoy this solo episode. Coming up on the podcast next week, we have real estate investor and agent Erica Brown.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Dreamers Podcast. You can find the episode show notes and all of the links mentioned at dreamoflegacy.com. If you liked today's episode, here's what you can do to support me and help more dreamers discover the podcast. Follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Rate and review the podcast to help the podcast gain more visibility. Share the podcast with your family, friends, and coworkers. And if you really enjoyed today's episode, please take a second to tag me at thedreamers.podcast on Instagram and let me know what you liked about today's episode. All right, dreamers, that's it for today. I will see you back here next week for another episode of the Dreamers Podcast.
Okay, dreamers, time to build this legacy.
This podcast is for general information purposes only. It is not intended to provide any tax, legal, financial planning, insurance, accounting, investment, or any other kind of professional advice or services. Please consult with an appropriate tax, financial, or legal professional to receive appropriate advice based on your situation.
Sunday, Skincare Day, is one of the ways I keep my sanity in these crazy times. DREAMER'S is an all-natural, Black-owned skincare brand carefully handcrafted by parents who could not find the proper care solutions to address their family skin problems. All Dreamino products are made of organic and high-quality ingredients, meticulously chosen to give your skin the smooth results and the glow it deserves.